welcome to another episode of Disaster Empire. This is the podcast where we talk to thought leaders and innovators in resilience. And this time around, I have Steven Kuhr, and it's really great to have him here because we first met on a coffee chat with a colleague of ours, Daniela McCoy, and she was great in bringing us together. So I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. Welcome so much.
Good morning. Yeah, thrilled to be here. I've been watching your podcast for quite some time, and it really was great to meet you on the coffee chat. And that's really a great thing that Daniela has set up. I'm glad that she's done that, and she's also appearing as a guest on my podcast in a couple 3 weeks.
Excellent, and definitely have to give her a plug for that. So we'll give a link for those folks that might want to join. It's a great forum to get folks together from various disciplines and just have informal conversations. So, hey, we're going to dive right in and talk about crisis management and resilience. But I want to start off and ask you really what got you started in your podcast, 5 Minutes to Chaos?
I didn't even know what podcasts were up until around 2016. I was leading an emergency management team for a utility in Colorado, and this guy named Todd DeVoe, who we all know, is reached out to me, and he's like, "Hey," and that's Todd, right? Would you be on my show? I'm like, okay. So actually, he records live and then it appears as a podcast. And I did basically what is utility emergency management. And then he had Kelly McKinney and I and somebody else on, talked about mass notifications, mass communications. And I was like, I got to do this. I'm very active in social media. And I thought it would be a good opportunity for me with my breadth of experience to give something back to the business. Well, then this pesky little global infectious disease outbreak started, and the organization I work for activated, and we went into crisis management mode for at least 2 years, and we had a virtual CMT, which I was part of, and so we got pretty busy. We had many COVID infections in the community we served in the organization. So, and we provide lifeline services as a utility. So we had supply chain stuff to worry about, and electric generation, water production. So we got pretty busy. As the pandemic started winding down, if you could say that, I started thinking about the podcast again, and I assembled a thought group, Kelly, Todd, and my wife, and said, "Hey, I want to do this podcast." And so Todd said, "You're a great storyteller." So just literally what he said was, just turn the mic on and the rest will just happen. And I said, well, I need a name for this thing. And I think probably about a year ago, they were talking about the atomic clock. And every time the nuclear threat changes, we're now, 1 minute to midnight. I'm like, that's it, 5 minutes to chaos. And that's really the secret there. So I don't want you to tell anybody that. So
we're not making this public at all.
We're not, right? Right. So that's that. And I started thinking about some of the chaotic events I've been in, and it really was from notification to absolute chaos. It's kind of like that. Get a call from we had a wildfire chief in the utility. Hey, Drake is burning. That was a power plant. I look out my window. Power plant is billowing smoke. We went into crisis mode in less than 5 minutes. World 9/11. I was at a conference in Florida, and a friend of mine grabs me and says, "Hey, a small plane just hit the World Trade Center." Well, we don't know what happened there, and my life devolved into chaos. And I worked that for quite a while. So that's really it. And if you, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about 5 minutes to chaos. And if individuals, colleagues in the profession listen, you'll hear some stories from emergency managers whose lives have devolved into chaos. I mentioned Todd twice now. Well, here's his third plug. He talks about an active shooter event where he responded to, and he was first in and encountered a mass casualty, mass fatality event. He just went so long, we split it into 2 episodes because he was emotional, and it was a very, very sensitive thing. Anne Marie
Mm.
McLaughlin, head of emergency management up at New York University, talked about the Boston bombing. She wasn't in charge of it, but she was in a corner of the response as an emergency manager at a university in Boston at the time. So that's an example.
Yeah, lots of great stories like that. I had David Trout from Raytheon on, and he had worked for Massachusetts for the Department of Public Health as a regional coordinator, and talked about his experience with the Boston bombings and having to stop the race. So, if folks haven't seen that, go check it out. But yeah, it's amazing, right? The stories and the things that our colleagues live through and are able to talk about those experiences. But tell me a little bit more about the podcast and its format, because one of the things that I saw was that you were looking at I think like a really open format and having people just jump on and free flow talk about what they're going through. Is that correct?
It is a media experience in the different roles I've been in, having had to, stand in front of the microphone during emergencies or, do press ops when I was in the fire department in EMS in New York, for example. The our press secretary would tap me on the shoulder. Hey, it's a heat wave out there. Could you stand up and tell the people that they need to drink water and stay hydrated? And yeah, so I mean that was early in my career, and I just found like I had a little bit of a knack for it. So disasters, crises are extemporaneous by nature, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to just have sort of a radio show on unscripted format. Most times I don't know what the emergency manager is going to talk about. Sometimes I do. Todd gave me a head up because he wanted sort of the nod that it would be okay to talk about a violence event. And of course it was. And in the show notes, you'll see a content warning because he talks about some stuff. I thought it would be good to have that free flowing, open dialogue, unscripted. There are so many, and I started putting together a podcast similar to this one, which I
Mhm.
absolutely adore, and some of the others that are out there. I've been on Employee Safety Podcast, Mind the Resilience. A gentleman out of India is doing a great job at that. And get the questions, prepare myself, and I love that. I want to continue doing that, evidenced by me being here. But I wanted to do something a little different, and I do send out. I wouldn't call it a script, but it's just like here's what today's going to look like,
Yeah.
and it's not much different than what you sent, and except it's just a little more free flowing. And then I
Yeah.
would talk about careers, and then at one point say, okay,
Well, that's great because it allows people to talk about what's top of mind for them and the experiences they've had. And for those in the field, I'm sure it's so helpful to hear about that and those coming up, like what to expect, right? So
yeah.
you're sharing some of those war stories, but some of those practical, I'm sure, experiences as well. But hey, as you know, this podcast is all about resilience. So this is a question I ask all of my guests. What does resilience mean to you?
So I want to start by saying, and I think you and I actually had some chat about this. I struggle with the word resilience
Mm-hmm.
in today's world as sort of an old timer in emergency management. I've been in the business for since the 80s, really, in one format or another. And the last few years, people such as yourself have exploded on the scene and consider themselves resilience managers or resilience professionals. And so I sort of wanted to understand what that is, and I started poking around. And I
Mm-hmm.
actually have an episode of my podcast coming up where we did a roundtable with four highly credentialed emergency management, crisis management, resilience professionals, and we talk about definitions of crisis management and resilience.
That's
I
great.
think it's really hard to achieve true organizational resilience without investments. Now, maybe that's the public side of me thinking about mitigation and money to do prevention. In my lean forward crisis management mentality, I believe a resilient organization is one that has the ability recognize a threat, activate a crisis management team that could be one person if it's just
Mm-hmm.
monitoring, put a team together where a threat is real or an incident has happened, and respond to that threat or incident based on what has occurred and based on the pre-planning that has taken place up until that point. You cannot account for everything out there. No risk assessment is going to identify every potential threat. No risk assessment. And I've been in, and I was an emergency management leader in New York City, talked about smoke from wildfires in California, rather Canada, and so you can't account for everything. So you have to have a team that's skilled, exercised, and ready to react to whatever technology, man, or nature has to throw at you.
And I think that's great. If I'm tracking what you're saying, I think sometimes with resilience, the lean is let's try to prevent anything bad from happening, and I don't think that's realistic, right? That's never going to be the case. And it really, a lot of people talk about that bounce back feature. It's really preparing. I think the organization, that's really where I see the shift. It's not that in emergency management and business continuity, crisis management, et cetera. We always have talked about preparedness, right? That's always been an important component. I think we're just really highlighting and leaning in that area to really understand risks and threats even more so than we've done in the past. I think the field has been understandably a bit more reactive, and this is trying to get ahead of, right, the next trend, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, or
Yeah.
then the issues, and really trying to understand what the impacts could be before they hit an organization. And then I think it's a recognition that you were saying, look, there are going to be those things like the wildfire and the smoke from Canada, coming down to New York City, for example, that's just unexpected. Like it's not something that's usually on the radar. And I think we always have to be prepared for those unplanned events too.
And that's what
That's a
makes
great
us all the
point.
same. Whether you're a resilience professional or crisis manager, and I know you do that as well in the corporate sector, or you are a public sector emergency manager, everything you just said emergency managers do or need to do. Where it differs, I believe, is in governance. It's who we report to. So you report
Absolutely.
to,
The
I don't
CEO
know who you
ultimately,
report, a
right?
CEO. So let's say a CEO, and the CEO reports to a board of directors.
Yep.
So a public sector emergency manager reports to typically a chief elected official, and a chief elected official, depending if it's a strong or weak mayor type of system, may report to a city council.
Yep.
And in the utility I worked for, our CEO reported to the city council, which served also as a utility board. So that's really, but everything you just said. So you are an emergency manager as much as I'm a resilience professional,
Yeah.
and I think that's good.
Well, hey, talk to me about the Kerr Group and what you're doing with that. And I know services are support that you're supporting are around emergency management and crisis management, but would love to have you talk about that and get that information out to the audience because, as you said, you have a depth and breadth of knowledge, that spans back quite a bit now,
Yeah.
back into the 80s. And there's, I think, a lot that you can bring to the table. So tell me about how you would help your customers and who your best clients might be.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So it's not my first rodeo when it comes to being in the private sector. I have been fortunate to have wonderful roles in the public sector. As I mentioned, I was with New York City Office of Emergency Management. I did state emergency management for a bit. I have, even in my consulting roles, I have had opportunity to work with high profile lifeline or corporate organizations. I've consulted for Amtrak, CNN, New York Yankees, the World Bank. That was a fascinating project,
I
developing a
bet.
global crisis management plan for 130 offices, and that was just that was really effective. Had a company about 20 years ago, then got picked up, and I worked for a company called Kroll. You may be familiar with Kroll. Kroll is,
Yeah.
I make it sound like, it's just Kroll, but Kroll is a global company with offices in 6 countries. That was one of our taglines. And I was asked to take on the crisis management, emergency management practice out of the New York office. And I did that for quite a while. Then I jumped back into the public sector. I did in state, and the utility job was also a public sector
Mm-hmm.
job. When that came to a conclusion in Colorado, we decided to move to Florida. I'm currently in West Palm Beach. We had the property here, but we didn't really come here because of the pandemic. We bought it just before the pandemic, and I decided to drop a shingle again and start networking and providing our services to clients. So to answer your question direct would be a little difficult because in theory, anybody needs consulting services when it comes to emergency and crisis management. When I say anybody, I mean organizations. If you think about today's threats, so let's just take the threats in the region I'm in now. And we don't only work in South Florida. I just got back from Texas and Louisiana. We're working for big gas and oil on a project. So just the threats down here. And I say this saying I understand the threats are, but not all the people in Florida or the businesses do. So
Mm,
hurricanes. There's an
right.
aloofness about hurricanes because we're Floridians and we got that. Well, you got that until you don't. Stoneman Douglas High School, about 45 minutes south of me, major active shooter event a couple of years, 5 years ago. I tragically passed the school all the time on the way to different locations. Flooding, wildfires. We get wildfires in the Everglades that push smoke into the urban areas. Transportation accidents. It's all there. It's all there. Any pick a
Pandemic.
risk. Well, yeah.
We had
Well,
that on the
that little
radar.
pesky thing. So, our target audience are really mid-sized and plus organizations that need to put a program together. Principally, what we like to start with, and this is an emerging trend. You'll hear this from guys like Rob Burton over at PreparedX,
Yeah.
Bruce McIndoe over at McIndoe Advisory Services and I sort of came to the same conclusion. I'd like to start with an exercise. If you hired me as a consultant at Liberty and I came in and said, okay, let's do a risk assessment and a BIA, you'd be asleep in about 10 minutes and we'd be pumping coffee into you. It's just how it is. People get dry eyed, and to get their attention, what we're trying to do now is get them to the table and do tabletop exercise. Low stress, low intensity, discussion based, and through the skills of the facilitators, draw out from the people at the table what their threats and risks are. So
Mm,
we may start with a scenario just to whet the appetite, and then the hand grenade goes on the table. Hey, so we've been talking about flooding for the last 2 hours. What else are the threats that you can? How is your supply? What do you manufacture? And have you had supply chain issues? Oh my God! During the pandemic, we had so many. Yeah, and all of a sudden, you're getting it.
you're
From
getting it. Yeah.
there, next step is developing that crisis management plan, business continuity plan, what have you.
So it's great to hear you're not the first person recently that's been talking about leading forward with that exercise process first. And I think that's a really great idea for folks in the audience to really think about, because you're right, because it makes it real to them instead of coming in with the abstract, what are your risks, what are your impacts and what would you do
Right,
about
right.
them? And I think that's the way in operational resilience we're moving towards as well. And that's really getting a little more away from the all hazards, understanding that anything can happen, but making it more real for your customers, your stakeholders, and talking through scenarios that are impactful for them directly into their business, and understanding that. So I think that is an amazing idea. So along with that, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about what you're seeing in the industry, because it's definitely evolving. How have you seen the field change in emergency and crisis management since the 80s, as you referenced, and where do you think it's going?
I think emergency management has experienced growth spurts and then lulls and growth spurts and lulls. And I think we're in a bit of a growth spurt. When I was in New York City emergency management, I'll use that as sort of a pin on the calendar, because what I did before that was part of my job at the fire department. I was an
Mhm.
EMS citywide special operations supervisor, responsible to respond to major emergencies every day. Not that that wasn't a whole lot of fun. When we did our first threat assessment in New York City OEM, they were called HVAs at the time. They probably still are in some corners, hazard vulnerability analysis. It was just what you would expect for a coastal city. Subway accidents, mass violence. At the time, we were looking at chemical, biological terrorism. Some of that came true. Hurricanes, coastal city. Nobody thought about cyber. Well, they're really, we barely had cell phones. They weighed 20 pounds and they came in a bag. Nobody thought about cybersecurity except our IT guy at the time. He put this pesky little software on our computers to try to catch bugs, and it was actually working. The industry has gone from what I would call the mechanical disasters to a more technical realm over the years, and this period of time from the mid 90s to today is peppered with points on the calendar that have caused those highs and lows. So 9/11. 9/11 caused a greater recognition of actually two things happened. It caused a greater recognition of emergency management and need for preparedness, but the Bush administration created the Homeland Security Department. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 put emergency management inside DHS, disbanded FEMA, and it was called, I think, the Emergency Preparedness Response Directorate.
Mm-hmm.
The emphasis was on terrorism, not on natural hazard disasters. And Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, I was in New Orleans last week, just coincidentally, caused a recognition that emergency management needed to be endowed once again, and the post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act did that. It put FEMA back on the map, created a principal federal official reporting to the president, and that kind of thing. Along with that comes the rest of the industry. The rest of the emergency management industry follows. What's happened since Katrina is the growth of emergency managers, crisis managers, such as yourself in the private sector. I like to say since 2002, every NIP organization, so that's the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, has 16 critical infrastructures. Every organization that's part of one of those infrastructures, banking and finance, commerce, education, water, wastewater, energy, gas, has some form of emergency management. So what I'm seeing is growth in that regard. Mm-hmm. I'm starting to see now, I think there was a divergence. We kind of spoke about that before. There was a bit of a divergence. There was emergency management in the public sector and private sector. Like, what are those business continuity people? What are those resilience guys? What is that? And now I'm starting to see it come together because I believe you and I in the past 20 minutes have demonstrated that we do the same thing. Every word you use is for what you do from a crisis risk management perspective is done in the public sector. So I'm glad to see the industry coming together. It'll continue to come together and manage today's threats, cyber, AI, supply chain, and of course the conventional natural hazards are just getting worse with climate-driven disasters. The wildfires I experienced in Colorado and that we see annually in California and Colorado are seriously catastrophic. Tornadoes are moving east. They're not just in Tornado Alley anymore. You're going to start seeing them in the Ohio Valley. I mean, we've had tornadoes on the East Coast. They're getting more frequent. I can go on.
Yeah, definitely. It is an interesting time, right? I think there's a Chinese proverb about that. May you live in interesting times, that we're in today. And you were talking about, for us in emergency and crisis management, kind of what we're seeing ahead too. Can you talk a little bit more about what you see as the challenges, or do you see the skills or the needs of the emergency manager or the crisis manager changing from where you started from?
So you and I, you posted a really great blog. Actually, I think two of them. We talked about polycrisis, and I think today's emergency manager. And when I say emergency manager, I mean wherever you sit on the spectrum, private, public sector, needs to be able to respond to and operate in polycrisis. And I believe that is for a couple reasons. One, I think there's more recognition of these crises because we had some online chatter about this, because there's more recognition of them because of today's communication technologies. The most powerful communication tool ever is in your pocket, by way of an iPhone or an Android, whatever your choice phone is. And just the stream of breaking news and intel, like what I call intel, information I get, we feed each other stuff, is just crazy. But so let's take an enterprise situation such as you're in, or such as I'm consulting for in Texas, Louisiana. If you have, you cannot just have a posture where you're ready to respond to insert X. You have to have that posture where you're ready to respond to insert double 3X, because at the same time you're having a cyber incident, that could be coupled with a physical attack. That's not the newest thing in the world, where organizations are sort of looking at both the cyber and the physical at the same time. Or is your cyber attack actually a physical attack, meaning somebody just brought a thumb drive in and they got in, they made it in, or that,
and we're seeing both. Right. We're seeing both in situations, especially from activist groups. They tend to use multiple channels, right, to try to influence an organization to do what they want it to do. They can do the physical and they can do the digital. And I think
No.
that's something people really have to be aware of.
Political violence. Let's not forget that. That is also a new risk. We are heading into another period of political violence. I forecast. I don't have any intel on that. I think with just without getting into any details, just read the news and pick up a paper if they still exist. Go to your favorite newspaper and just read what's going on in the world. See what went on in Miami yesterday, and I think you'll find that. So, to answer your question, emergency managers need to be adroit at understanding and managing all those threats so they can stand up the right posture, bring the right people to the table. Because your crisis management team may not have a wildfire smoke expert. New York City, I'd have to find somebody, and we'd find somebody in the Department of Health, Department of Environmental Protection to come in and guide us. So you just have to have that extra seat at the table for that unanticipated risk person.
Absolutely. Steven, thank you so much for that. Hey, we're having to wrap up, but I wanted to ask, is there anything else that you wanted to share with the audience we didn't get a chance to talk about yet today?
I think I'm about growth. So I like to see young people grow in the organization. I met with Kyle Dixon yesterday. I'll give him a shout out. He lives here in Jupiter, Florida, and he's a young man trying to break into emergency management. He's on LinkedIn. He works for the American Red Cross. And so he said, hey, old guy, could you meet with me? And we had a nice lunch. I am encouraged to see young people still interested in what you and I do. So I would encourage young people looking to break into the business, or they're out there right now floating around in LinkedIn. Don't be discouraged. Kyle was a little discouraged. He's interviewing for a big job today in Vermont, and I wish him the best. Don't be discouraged. Follow people such as Ashley, myself, Todd DeVoe. I mean, there's Kelly McKinney. I have 7,000 people. I can't list all of them, but, connections on LinkedIn. But there are a lot of people out there posting really good content. Don't just look at communities for emergency management jobs. As I mentioned, every NIP sector, so every infrastructure, every industry has some sort of an emergency management function, crisis management, business continuity. Look for something, you'll find something.
That's a great point. Hey, anything in terms of your background, just in terms of your bio that you wanted to share that you hadn't already as well?
And you'll probably never guess this. I have a university level certificate as a wine professional.
Wow.
Because my midlife crisis was, right, and the thing is, I don't even drink that much wine. Right. So that wow, left field, where did that come from? So my midlife crisis, about 2005 or 2006, I started attending classes at the Culinary Institute of America. So the CIA, as it's colloquially called, not that CIA, it has two main campuses, one in Hyde Park, New York, which you may be familiar with, being a New Englander. That's the big culinary campus. And then there's another culinary and wine campus in California, in the Napa Valley in St. Helena. So I flew out there for a number of, so that you could do at the time, you were able to do a wine immersion. It's like a 6-week, you're embedded. Wow. And you attend classes. I broke it up because I was running a business. I was doing consulting, emergency management at the time. So you go and you spend the morning learning about a wine. You go to a winery. You get a lecture from a winemaker. You go to the vineyards, and then the rest of the afternoon you sit and you don't drink wine. You swirl and spit because it's about learning. So that's my fun fact. And what does that do for me as an emergency manager? It allows me to be the big shot at table when we're out to dinner with friends to pick out the greatest wine at the cheapest price. That's my story.
Nice. I love it. Thank you so much for sharing that. And hey, Steven, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Make sure to link to your podcast in the show notes below. And wanted to thank the audience for please sticking with us and joining in the conversation. Really appreciate you being here. Please like and share to help grow the channel. And thank you again, Steven. Thank you so much. It was great to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ashley.